I'd like to show you a time lapse of an acrylic portrait using the glazing technique. This is a technique where you mix a little bit of paint with a large amount of matte medium, and we paint very translucently, similar to the way the old masters painted years ago. Glad you're here and hope to share more with you. This is a fun way to paint. I hope you try it sometime. Let's continue on. This 11 by 14 acrylic portrait is one for a friend that I did a commission painting, where it was very important to have the couple depicted with their trellis. I believe they're clematis plants, and they're very proud of them. We just wanted to paint with all the detail we could. So we start with a really detailed sketch and just add these glazes on. Now currently I'm painting the facial features and the hair, just kind of dialing in the darkest areas of contrast first. But again, with the glazing technique, because we don't paint very opaquely at all, you can layer your colors over time and preserve the detail of your sketch. It works really well for small portraits where you have to incorporate a lot of detail. As we see here, I'm working on the shadows, darkest values within the clothing, and just really trying to get those forms accurate, mixing raw umber dark, ultramarine blue, maybe a little alizarin crimson for that. Now cycling into the shadowed areas of the foliage, and for that we use ultramarine blue, a bit of phthalo blue, raw umber dark, and raw sienna. And we just basically work in and out, keeping the midtones, keeping the highlights preserved as much as possible, while developing the shadows to build up contrast. Now we're working on the face, and in this technique you rotate, working on various areas, so you don't have to wait for the paint to dry. You can always keep something moving with this technique, and it's a little bit different than the glazing technique done with oils, where you'd have to put on a glaze and wait days, maybe even weeks for it to dry. Here it dries very quickly, and we just continue to build up the depth. And we're adding more contrast to that trellis, really trying to get those large value areas, large shadows, while preserving some of the highlights, keeping those areas open. And then doing some work on the background, just developing some of the tones of the house. Now getting in some of the reds and darker values, trying to get a good cohesive color harmony going on with the color of her clothing, the color of the background. A lot of that was actually in the reference photo, but I intensified it by omitting some of the colors that didn't match, and then by intentionally making the ones that did match even more. So you can see I did another layer on her clothing, alizarin crimson, naphtha red, maybe a little bit of burnt sienna. Now getting some of the colors in on the flowers. We used a hot pink, dioxazine purple, ultramarine blue, even a little bit of phthalo blue. Trying to get some of those nuances, getting just a little bit of a pinkish hue in the flowers, again to match her clothing and the background. You can see I did another layer on her pants and his pants. You can actually do many different colors together to achieve black. You don't have to just use ivory black. You can mix ultramarine blue, raw umber, or raw umber dark is what I use. Phthalo blue, alizarin crimson, many different colors to achieve black. Now adding more shadows on top of shadows within the plants. And again, leaving just a little bit of highlight shapes. If you're trying to paint realistically, you don't want to over pattern things. You want to really look for the specific value shapes. Now I'm adding more contrast to the face. You can see you go over it a couple of times. You don't just do it all in one layer. Going over several layers really helps to create a lot of depth, a lot of shading, a lot of nuances, and that's how you really achieve a high level of realism in acrylic. You can do it opaquely, but it's much more difficult to do opaquely, because then you have to get your colors perfect the first time. Whereas with the glazing technique, you really can have many opportunities to dial in the colors that you're wanting to achieve in the final look. So we go over her clothing again and dialing in some of the shadowed forms. So not just the color, but also the value structure, the specific shapes of some of these shadows. Now adding a little bit of work onto the background, more dark values on the upper part of the trellis, building in that depth, building in that realism, dialing in some of the forms of the leaves. You can see I have a lot of green on my palette. Continuing, adding more and more dark shadows within the trellis. Dialing in some of the exterior leaf shapes. You want to remember some of the leaf shapes are not shaped exactly what you think leaves look like. Some have very skinny shapes as they're turned on their sides. Trying to isolate a few more of the forms of the flowers by putting in some more leaf shapes and getting the flower shapes more specific. Again, the trellis is a huge part of their portrait, so I want to make sure I have that right. And now I'm working on their faces, getting a little more of the skin tone dialed in. I use naphtha red, raw umber dark, a bit of raw sienna, and those colors seem to work pretty well for these skin tones. There's not one size fits all skin tone recipe that you can use for everybody, because lighting scenarios are different, people's ethnicities are different, so many different factors. Okay, and now we're working on those leaves again. You can see I just kind of rotate around on different parts of the portrait, because that way then nothing ever feels that intimidating. I don't have a big white unfinished area of the canvas staring me in the face. If you're working on portraits with tight deadlines like I usually do, this is a great way to do it, because even when the portrait is not as done as you might like it to be, you could still call it done and feel as if it's done, because there's not any white areas of the canvas that glaringly indicate that it's unfinished. So it just gives you psychologically kind of a calmness as you're painting, as everything looks kind of finished, but it's just getting more finished. There's just more contrast, more depth that you're building up on top of your good foundation. Now we're dialing in some of the interior midtones and isolating highlights on their faces. It takes a small round brush to do that, especially in a portrait like this where their faces are just, you know, 1.5 inches or so long. And if you keep your paint very fluid with this technique, the paint is always very fluid. It's quite easy. Well, I would say it's super easy, but it's much easier to get these details dialed in, even on canvas. So the paint is always fluid. I mix a little bit of water with a mister and the matte medium, so there's very little texture that actually competes with my brushwork. And now I'm dialing in some details on his hands and his jean jacket. You get a combination of ultramarine blue and maybe a little bit of deoxyzen purple with some white, and then phthalo blue for the highlights. You go a little bit warmer for the highlights with the phthalo, that more of a greenish tint to the blue. It looks a lot better. It seems to really make it pop. Okay, and we're getting toward the end of the painting. I put in some details on her clothing, putting in the buttons on her shirt. Now getting some details in again on the trellis flowers, using a ruler just to kind of make sure I have a nice straight edge there. Going back, adding in some more dark values here, there, and everywhere, bringing it all together, taking the darkest shadows, blending them into the midtones. You just kind of build on top of all your previous foundations, dialing in some wrinkles. Got to dial in the wrinkles on her clothing, adding some highlights. Now going a little bit opaque, adding titanium white to some of my color mixes, still using matte medium. In the beginning I started off at maybe a 90% matte medium, 10% paint mix, but toward the end I'm going more maybe 70% matte medium, 30% paint, or even 50-50 in some areas for the details. So it's not like a watercolor painting where you have to isolate all of your highlights. you can actually go a little bit more opaque in some areas. And that's the ability we have with acrylics. See, and I went over his pants to kind of smooth out some of the roughness of the previous glazes using titanium white in the mixture, along with raw umber dark, ultramarine blue, etc. Now you can see him working on those flowers, really trying to get those finished. And I was down to the wire on this portrait. I had to get it done for Christmas, and every second counted. I mean, I literally finished it and shipped it to the client, delivered it actually, all in the same day. So it's wonderful to be able to use acrylic for an artist like me, and maybe you're the same way, where you have tight deadlines. Can't really do that with oils because oils take so long to dry, but with acrylic you can. And I love acrylic for that reason. I also love it for the fact that it's very non-toxic comparatively to oils, and just a lot less mess for cleanup, and I love it. I'm sold on acrylics. Adding some little highlights, these little highlights, getting those leaves to kind of pop out, you know, and you can go back in and kind of iron out the edges using the background color, working your way in, and, you know, adding some little nuances and details. See, to all the edges of these leaves, add a couple of floaters that kind of pop out there. And I said, no, I don't like that one. We'll cover over it with the white of the background. Yeah, see, I didn't like that one. You can make those changes with acrylic. Very, very easy to do, especially when everything dries so fast. There's no reason that acrylic has to be annoying to use because it dries quickly. You can actually utilize the fast-drying qualities of acrylic to your advantage. Now we're just about finished. I'm putting in just a couple of nuances on the walkway, the last few details, using titanium white and a couple of warmer earth tones. And I think we will call this painting just about finished. Well, thank you so much for watching, and I really appreciate it. If you would like to get in touch with me, check out my blog at realisticacrylic.com, where I have more tips, tutorials, and videos for you there. Thanks so much. God bless.